dethroning King Cotton. So the South was really counting on foreign intervention in order to win the war, and because more or less they never did get Britain or France to join the war on their side, they lost. It can be as simple as that. Most of the upper class, kind of the upper crust, the ruling class, you could say, of Europe, especially Britain, really did side with the South. They really had a kind of connection with the South because the South was kind of semi-feudalistic and really had that strict social order, kind of that aristocracy, and that really kind of tugged at the heartstrings, you could say, of the upper class of Britain and France. However, kind of the common folks, the laborers in Britain and France actually really connected with the North. So the rich people in Europe connected with the South. The common folks really connected with the North because a lot of them had read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and really equated a Northern victory with the abolition of slavery. So you can kind of see an interesting distinction there. Although, at first, we were really, officially the war was fought to preserve the Union. Over time, we'll see the war is more and more fought on moral grounds, on the grounds of slavery. Anyway, so, these common people, their stance against the South really prevented Britain from entering the war or even really helping the South at all during the war. Of breaking that naval barricade. Because remember, the British Navy was the best in the world, so if Britain had really wanted to break through the North's barricade, they easily could have. But because of these common people and their kind of rooting for the North, Britain never actually broke through the barricade in the South or entered the war on the South side. So, still, Great Britain was heavily dependent on the South's cotton. About 75% of the cotton that Great Britain consumed in its textile mills came from the South. So the question is, why wasn't this enough of a draw? Why didn't this cotton connection cause Great Britain to enter on the South side? Well, let me tell you a couple of reasons. First reason was that cotton production had been really good in the years leading up to the Civil War. So Britain actually had a surplus of cotton. So for the first year and a half of the war, Britain was doing fine. Britain was just kind of eating up this surplus of cotton it had purchased from the South before the war. Another reason, Britain was actually getting some cotton from the South. Okay, so once the Union forces started to invade the South, the Union would invade the South, capture the cotton, then sell the cotton to Britain that way. Also, some ships were able to actually break through the North's blockade and sell cotton to Britain that way. But another kind of huge reason is because there was such a demand for cotton in Britain, the prices of cotton went sky high. And then other countries, kind of responding to these really high prices of cotton, started to produce more cotton, most notably like India and Egypt. So India and Egypt started to plant more cotton, so Britain was kind of covered in that way. Another factor to remember is that, the unemployment caused by the lack of cotton. So there's a lot of unemployment in these textile mills because they didn't have enough cotton. That unemployment was kind of helped out by the fact that Britain kind of had a new industry, or the making of guns, the ammunitions industry really had, because of the Civil War, really was kind of booming. So a lot of people who had lost their jobs in the textile mills were able to find another job in kind of these ammunition factories. So that kind of helped out Great Britain as well. Okay, and also to keep in mind, Britain was having some bad years of harvest, so Britain was really dependent on the North for the importation of grain like corn and wheat. So Britain was really dependent on the North's shipments of this grain, and they figured that if they were, to enter the war on the south side, for sure the North would stop trading or stop this importation or this export of grain. So they figured, it was better that some were unemployed than everyone starve. Because, while the Great Britain was dependent on the South for cotton, Great Britain was dependent on the North for food. And when it comes to that, food usually wins out. All right, next section, the decisiveness of diplomacy. So when we're talking about diplomacy, we're talking kind of about foreign relations. And during this war, while Britain held a stance of neutrality, really, we were kind of walking on ice with Britain. We were kind of at the brink of war with Britain itself during the Civil War. So let's look at that a little bit here. Okay, one of the first big issues we had with Britain during the war revolved around the Trent Affair. So what is the Trent Affair? Well, let me tell you. So the North had stopped a British mail ship, so it's a ship just bringing mail. So the North had stopped this mail ship and kind of arrested two Confederate officers who were kind of just getting a ride to Europe. So they stopped this British ship, arrested these two Confederate officers, and this really ticked off the British people. This made the British people really mad because they felt that the North was ignoring their neutrality in this situation. So, they were crying for, British people were crying for war. Lincoln, not wanting to fight two wars at the same time, kind of prudently just gave up, released the Confederate, officers. Much better to release two officers than to make a war with Britain. All right. Grab my pen. Another issue we had with Britain revolved around a ship called the Alabama. Let's talk about it. Okay, so the British built this warship, the Alabama, for the Confederacy. Right? Remember, Britain is supposed to be neutral in this whole thing, so this can create some issues. The Alabama is just one example of many warships Britain was creating for the Confederacy. And they tried to get around it. There's kind of a loophole. So they would build these ships, but they wouldn't arm them in Britain. The ship would be built in Britain and then go to, say, Cuba, pick up the arms or the weapons, and then go to the South. So they kind of had this loophole. They weren't considered warships technically because when they left the British ports, they didn't have arms or they didn't have weapons on them. Nonetheless, what these ships were, these warships, I guess they're not technically warships. What they were is these were ships that the Confederates would use to kind of raid northern merchant ships. So the Alabama, for example, during its lifetime, raided and burned over 60 Union merchant ships. And this became such a big problem, the North had to divert some of its navy away from the blockade. Remember, the North was kind of stopping or trying to choke off Southern trade with this naval blockade. So this Alabama became such a big problem. These kind of raiding, these Southern ships that would raid Northern merchant ships became such a big problem that we actually had to take some of our navy away from their duties watching these harbors just to track down these warships. Yes, let's see. London, or the official government of Britain, did make some efforts to stop British people from building these ships, but all told, the Union lost about 250 merchant ships to these kind of British-built, Confederate-controlled raiding ships. And America was so angry at this, because remember, Britain was supposed to be neutral. They're so angry, there's actually talks of kind of in revenge invading Canada after the war ended. Remember, Canada was controlled by Britain, so we were so mad at instances like the Alabama or these British-built warships that we were even talking about, after this war is done, we are going to march straight into Canada and take away from Britain just in retaliation. I hope that made sense. Anyway, next section, foreign flare-ups. We're going to continue to talk about Britain, but also a little bit about France. Okay, so another Anglo-American crisis, Anglo meaning, England, crisis came about once again through some warships. What was happening is a British company was building these two warships for the Confederacy, or for the South. They were called the layered rams. So these two warships, and these weren't just kind of these puny little raider ships. These ships were built as, to destroy northern ships, because at this time most of the northern ships weren't iron, they're just simple wood ships. So these layered rams, these huge warships, they had iron rams on the top, they had these huge guns, they were just really built to destroy. And had they been delivered to the South, had they been delivered into the Confederacy's hands, they would have absolutely destroyed the naval blockade. And not only that, they would have been then able to be aggressive. They would have been able to go into northern towns and start bombarding ports in the north. So this would have been a disaster for the North had these ships actually arrived or been delivered to the South. So what we did is the kind of Britain really wanting to avoid war with the United States, because after all, if Britain had built these ships, given the ships to the South, the North would have most likely declared war on Britain. So Britain not wanting to go to war with America, hopefully this isn't too confusing, decided to actually buy the ships themselves. So Britain, not wanting to go to war with America, decided to buy these two layered ships instead of letting those go to the South. So that kind of avoided another war with Britain. And when all was said and done, Britain actually paid America about $15.5 million for all the damages it caused because of, I can't even talk. So Britain, when all was said and done, actually paid $15.5 million to United States for the damages caused by the Alabama and other merchant ships. That's what I meant to say. Anyway, another instance of Britain kind of getting involved in American affairs happened when the Confederacy would actually go into Canada, British-owned Canada, and would actually have raids on northern cities. So, not the best deal for Britain, but the South would actually send troops up to Canada and start raiding these northern cities. The Irish, who were in the north, who hated the British, actually kind of took matters into their own hands for a little bit, and they actually launched their own invasions of Canada with a few hundred men even during the war. So we can see tensions are really tight with Britain, and there was just, we were at the brink of war a number of times throughout the Civil War. All right, well, let's keep going. All right, so something that's interesting is Britain during the war, actually right after the war in 1867, they actually created the Dominion of Canada. So what they're doing is they're uniting Canada, because before this time during the war, Canada was actually 3 separate British colonies. But now Britain, kind of scared that America might seek revenge after the war, or might seek, might retaliate against all of these kind of injustices we felt Britain caused us during the war. They actually created more or less Canada as a country. They united Canada in 1867. Now you know. Okay, so we talked a lot about different instances or different crises we had with Canada, but we have to talk about France for just a little bit. So when America was busy fighting the Civil War, France kind of took their opportunity to overtake the government in Mexico. So Napoleon II of France, during America's preoccupation during the Civil War, took control of the Mexican government and kind of set up a puppet ruler. And this guy's name was Archduke Maximilian, and he set up Maximilian as kind of the emperor, you could say, of Mexico. And of course, by doing this, he's completely ignoring the Monroe Doctrine. And his thought was, well, now we're in America's, fighting the Civil War. I'm going to sneak into Mexico, take control, and then, probably the Union or the United States is going to split due to the Civil War officially, and then they won't be strong enough to kick me out. So this was kind of France's plan, while the cat's away, the mice will play. So during the Civil War, the North, starts to supply the French resistance movement with money. So those people in Mexico fighting against the French during the war, we supply them with money and really kind of get behind the president Benito Juarez. But once the Civil War ends, we decide to really, put an end to this French control of Mexico. Secretary of State Seward threatens to march troops into Mexico and to kick France out by force. Okay, Napoleon II, not really looking for a fight, just trying to find an easy way to get land, stops his support of this puppet government, and more or less, the poor Maximilian, this kind of the puppet president, ends up being shot by the Mexicans. So for just a little bit during the Civil War, France had actually taken control of Mexico, but after the Civil War, once we threatened to bring troops down south, France pulls out their support, leaving their puppet government more or less at the mercy of the Mexican government. Okay, next section, President Davis versus President Lincoln. Okay, so we're comparing and contrasting our two leaders during the war. Okay, so the Confederate government, they made a constitution. They were trying to establish themselves as a legit government. They actually looked a lot alike. So the Confederate government, the United States government, they looked a lot alike. Their constitutions looked fairly similar, except for the Confederacy had a much bigger emphasis on states' rights. So the states had a lot more power in the South than they did in the North. And because of this, it was really hard for the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, to really create a strong central government, which you need during a war. For example, some states in the South refused to have their soldiers fight outside of their state's boundary. So say you had, soldiers from Alabama. Alabama didn't want their soldiers fighting outside of their state. So the soldiers in Alabama had to stay in Alabama, for example. Also, at times Georgia threatened to leave the Confederacy. So really, Davis was an able leader, but he really wasn't loved on a personal level. In fact, the South threatened to impeach him a number of times. And plus, he had a number of nervous disorders and was completely overtaken by work. Completely, the task kind of was shown to be beyond his power. No one man could really pull together this whole war with this new country underway. So poor Davis, this war was too much for him to handle. Okay, so now let's talk about President Lincoln. Lincoln had some advantages. We talked about a lot of them before, but also think, Lincoln had an established government. Lincoln wasn't starting a country from scratch, okay? Lincoln was the North was financially stable. It was recognized as a country. That's a plus. And although Lincoln had less experience, actually, than Davis, Lincoln had kind of this gift of being able to interpret, popular opinion or the public opinion. He could really he had a feel for what was going on in his country, and also was a great leader. He could a lot of times lead public opinion instead of going against it. He was often able to kind of persuade or to lead the public to what his thoughts were. Very well respected in that way. And also, Lincoln was more tolerant of criticism. Lincoln was criticized up and down all throughout the war, but he was really able to kind of compartmentalize that, to kind of brush it off and do what needed to be done regardless of, what people may say about it. Okay, next section, limitations on wartime liberties. So Lincoln, due to wartime necessity, was very, shall we say, flexible when it came to upholding the Constitution. And for the most part, Congress was okay with that. For the most part, Congress went along with kind of Lincoln's breaking of the Constitution from time to time. And, Lincoln made it clear that his kind of like tyrant-like authority was going to end as soon as the war ended. So he was definitely willing to kind of stretch his powers as president, but he made it clear that after the war, he wouldn't act like such a dictator or such a tyrant. Anyway, so let's talk about, there's just kind of a laundry list of different ways Lincoln more or less, more actions that Lincoln took that could be considered unconstitutional. Okay. For example, because Congress wasn't in session when the war broke out, on his own authority, he proclaimed the blockade of the South. He would increase the size of the army at whim, which was something that was supposed to happen in Congress. He gave over $2 million without approval to private citizens for war purposes. He arranged supervised voting in the border states, where he would more or less have armed soldiers at the voting booth, kind of to intimidate people into voting the right way during elections. He arrested editors and suspended some newspapers for obstructing the war. So if he didn't like what the newspapers were printing, he would just more or less stop that newspaper. And also, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus. And what that is, the writ of habeas corpus made it that a petition was, a writ of habeas corpus is a petition requiring law enforcement to present detained individuals or those who are arrested before a court in order to make sure that their arrest was legal. So because he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, more or less it let, Lincoln could arrest whoever he wanted for whatever reason he wanted. So it gave him a lot of power that way. And while Lincoln was able to kind of get away with this in the North, Davis in the South, at the mercy of, strong local rights supporters, he couldn't get away with anything like this. Okay, so just kind of goes to show you. Okay, and with that, I think this is enough for this video.